Good afternoon. My name is Derek Olson. I'm the president of WorldOregon, and it's wonderful to have you join us today for our webinar with the distinguished journalist and author Peter Laufer on his book, Up Against the Wall, The Case for Opening the Mexican-American Border. It's a brand new book, has a foreword by former Mexican President Vicente Fox, who spoke for us most recently in 2019. Peter has a storied history in journalism and academia and has been a repeat presenter for us, very popular with our audiences. It's wonderful to have him back today. Just a few general words about the webinar before I hand it over to Peter. I think most of you probably been to one of our webinars before, but if you haven't, just want to remind you this is a Zoom webinar. All participants' audio is muted and video is turned off, except for WorldOregon staff and our presenter. You can ask questions of the presenter through the Q&A function of Zoom. Also, my colleague, Tim DeRoche, the Director of Programs, will be posting in the chat function a link on buying his book on Amazon. It's a brand new book, just hot off the press. We may also be posting other relevant links in the chat. This webinar is being recorded for posterity and to be put up later on our YouTube channel, so mind your P's and Q's in your questions. And again, we remind you that the WorldOregon webinars are a benefit of your membership in WorldOregon, which financially supports our ability to be able to put on great programs like this. At the end of the show, we'll talk about some of our upcoming events. But now to our speaker. Peter Laufer has a PhD and holds the inaugural James Wallace Chair in Journalism at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication, where he was awarded the Marshall Prize for Teaching Innovation. A former and longtime global correspondent for NBC News, Laufer has reported on borders, identities, and migration extensively. And he has covered multiple wars, earthquakes, coups, and elections, just has a tremendous amount of experience and a very unique perspective on what is a very challenging issue. Reminder that as a nonpartisan organization, WorldOregon presents speakers from a range of viewpoints and perspectives to have intellectually stimulating debate and discussion with our audience. Without further ado, Professor Peter Laufer.
Thank you so much, Derek. And to your last point, I think it's a great place to start here, because when I look at the issue of the border, this specific border that I write about, the Mexican-American border, I look for ways, even though my proposals may be considered radical by some, even by many, I look for ways where we can start with a foundation of agreement. And I think that that foundation of agreement can be, no matter our political points of view, no matter our social points of view, that the border is out of control. The border is chaos. There is an ongoing crisis on the border. It isn't something new. It is a historical reality that there is tension on that border. So if we start from that place where we agree on that, then I think we can begin to talk about solutions or possible solutions or moves toward moderating that chaos. And that's what I do with my proposal to open the Mexican-American border. And I'll get to that in a moment, but first I want to follow up on what Derek said. And the welcome that I get from WorldOregon is so gracious. It's so terrific to be back even in this virtual Zoom manner where I can't see those of you out in the audience. I know you're there and I can feel your energy. It's great to have you there. WorldOregon played an integral part in the development of this book because last year, as Derek mentioned, Vicente Fox spoke to a live audience. And I was in that audience, both to hear what he had to say, but selfishly also because I thought he would make an ideal forward author for this book. And WorldOregon, through the offices of Tim DeRoche and the rest of the crew, helped facilitate a meeting that involved an invitation for me to come down to Guanajuato to Vicente Fox's hacienda there, which is now a boutique hotel. The the money raised supports his presidential library, the first Mexican presidential library along the lines of the kinds of presidential libraries we have up here. And I went down and met with him, and we talked about the book, and he agreed to author the foreword. But what I learned when I was down there is an example of the special relationship that we up here north of the border have with Mexico, multiple special relationships that I think help fuel my argument for opening the Mexican-American border. And one of those things I learned was that Vicente Fox, the former president of Mexico, Vicente Fox's grandfather is from, or was from, he's no longer alive, was from Ohio. He's an immigrant. He was an immigrant into Mexico. He suffered some sort of respiratory ailment, I believe it was asthma. His doctor said, you must go where it's hot and dry. And he got on the train, and he got off the train serendipitously, according to family lore, in Guanajuato. And a typical American, because remember, we all are Americans, even though we tend to talk about those north of the border as Americans and those south of the border as Mexicans. We're all Americans here. And a typical American success story, he got a job, I believe it was in a bicycle factory or a bicycle shop, and he worked his way up. He bought the shop, he continued to prosper. He eventually bought the hacienda where I stayed at the boutique hotel while I was down there. And the hacienda is surrounded by walls. And when Vicente Fox and I were talking about walls, and particularly about the wall that President Trump famously said he would build and Mexico would pay for, and he's built about 3 miles of new wall in his almost 4 years in office. We talked about walls conceptually and across time, and that's what a lot of the book is. What are walls? Why do we need walls or think we need walls? What walls could we consider are good walls, and what walls are counterproductive walls? And President Fox said to me, my grandfather built these walls because, we're talking about 100 years ago now, he had to protect the hacienda from Pancho Villa and Pancho Villa's revolutionaries. So there was a wall that, at least from the standpoint of Vicente Fox's grandfather, was doing good, a wall of protection. And it's interesting to look at now from the vantage point of a Mexico that often still needs walls because of internal problems in Mexico. So it was terrific to meet with him. And my plan was this week or next to be down there presenting a copy of the book to him. But of course, in these COVID times, it's not just an encounter like we're having here that needs to be separated, and there'll be a delay for that trip. But thank you to WorldOregon for facilitating that relationship. Now, about that special U.S.-Mexico relationship. Here we are in Oregon, just south of us, California, and across the Southwest, as many of you undoubtedly know, this was all part of Mexico. And so if we go back to the Polk administration in the mid-19th century, the US staged a war of aggression against Mexico with a Gulf of Tonkin-like resolution to create a conflict that provided President Polk with an excuse to attack Mexico and Mexican soldiers. And the result was about half of the country became part of the United States of America, the Southwest and California. This was by design. Polk said overtly in public speeches to his cabinet, written into his diary, that manifest destiny was part of his policy, and he wanted that land for the United States. So our fraught history goes back at least that far. The interactions that we have with Mexico and with Mexicans go back at least that far. We can look around the world, as I do in the book, at borders, at migration that's fueled by family reunification, that's fueled by personal finances. And we can see different walls that we might think are inappropriate, depending on our points of view, or appropriate. There certainly are walls. I'm looking over here at the front door to my house. I'm broadcasting from my house, and it's locked. I don't want anybody to come in while we're talking. There are walls that we can appreciate and embrace. But the wall between the United States of America and Mexico, between these two Americas, has always been problematic. And I believe there's an easy fix. And the easy fix, to cut right to the chase, to not bury the headline, as we say in journalism, is that we open that border to any Mexican who wants to come north. Now, the reality is, pretty much any Mexican who wants to come north already comes north. And that creates a problem for them and for us, because most of them are coming north undocumented. They're crossing the border and violating a law by crossing the border. Now, if we look north to the Canadian border, Canadians can come south. They show some sort of identification. It's checked. It's determined that they're not wanted for something, that we feel okay about them coming into the country, which is most Canadians who want to come south. This is, of course, pre-pandemic. We are in a unique situation now that we all hope will pass relatively quickly. And they can come down here without a visa other than that stamp in the passport for 6 months and do what they wish to do down here legally, we hope. So the concept is mirror that with our other adjacent neighbor. Mexicans can't do that now. We have two systems. Mexicans cannot just drive up and show identification, get checked, and we say bienvenidos to them, or welcome. Mexicans have restrictions that make it very difficult to engage in the kind of travel into this country that Canadians can. So my proposal is that Mexicans have an equal opportunity as Canadians to come on up and do whatever they want to do here, legally, of course. Get a job, go to school, go to Disneyland, visit family, tour this great country of ours. And why not? Why not? Because what is perversely going on now is that we solicit people to come up here. And in order for most of them to come up here, they must break the law. We're complicit. We're complicit every time we buy something that a Mexican who is up here had a part in creating, in growing, in harvesting, in cooking, in cleaning if we're going into some service-oriented business like a hotel. And the list is long. And we have a declining population. We have need for these workers. Just north of us in Oregon and Washington State a couple of years ago, we had a crisis with the pear crop because there weren't enough workers because of restrictions on the border that made it harder even for those who were coming up without papers to get into this country. NAFTA and its cousin, the current agreement, allow for relatively free movement of capital, relatively free movement of goods, but not relatively free movement of people, of workers, of labor. We need to figure out a way to equal this. Now, we have further problems down the border, past the Mexican border, of course, in Central America with people who want to come up to this country. That can be dealt with another time, maybe with somebody else's ideas. But immediately, the bulk of the problem that we face that allows for the demagoguery that the border creates as opportunity for politicians, the bulk of that is with migration from Mexico into the United States by Mexicans. So if we can take care of that, at least in part, nothing's a complete solution, but if we can take care of that, at least in part, then we can take the phenomenal resources, both man and woman power and technology of the Border Patrol, and focus it on the people we really don't want up here. Because just like I don't want somebody coming in the front door over there and disturbing this broadcast, there are people we do not want in this country. But we can't keep track of them when the border is out of control, which it is. I've spent time on the border, a lot of time on the border, and I look at the border pretty much as being from Chiapas all the way up to Niagara Falls. It's a fluid border, but right there on the line at the flashpoint, I've spent time with Border Patrol officers going back and forth on the border. I've spent time on the other side of the border. I've spent time with people who cross the border illegally. It doesn't stop those who really want to get here for the most part. And again, a reason is that we solicit them. Another reason, of course, is the dysfunctional Mexican economy, the out of control crime there. There are serious problems in Mexico that most of us would not want to be in the midst of. That's an issue, that's part of the issue, but we can take this incrementally and initially open the border for Mexicans who want to come here. Mexicans we check just the same way we do Canadians. You can bet there's some Canadians we don't want down here and they get stopped at the border. And you can bet that there's some Canadians we don't want down here that go from Manitoba into North Dakota and make it in here. Nothing is going to be foolproof, but I believe this is a first stop. One of the things, and I look forward to your questions, and that will help direct much of our conversation here today, but one of the things I look at in the book is borders across time, our borders across time and borders across culture. And basically they don't work. Sometimes they last longer than others. I lived in Berlin for a year before the wall came down and another year after the wall came down. And that was one of the most secure borders ever anywhere. And yet it still, as you undoubtedly know, was violated. And just after Erich Honecker said, it's going to last here forever, he no longer was lasting as a leader of East Germany, which soon did not even exist, and the wall came down. There was no crisis other than the immediate fluctuations that had to occur to accommodate the changes. We need to look at the reality of walls turning into tourist attractions. And I believe, look forward to the time when we go down to San Diego and Tijuana and we're buying t-shirts looking back at the time when that was a barrier and eating ice cream cones while we think about what that barrier was. That's what goes on now in Berlin. And we need to take into account how to deal with the fact that there are now more borders separating nations in the world than there were when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. So we're doing something wrong. And maybe we, the people of the world, by trying to create these barriers between us, one of the most horrendous, from my point of view, is the one on the Hungarian-Serbian border. There, Hungary part and Serbia to a different extent because it was part of Yugoslavia, but Hungary there in Middle Europe, which suffered so much from being behind the Iron Curtain, now constructs a fence to try to keep out the other, the refugees, the asylum seekers, largely from Syria and from Afghanistan. So, Up Against the Wall is the title of the book, in large part because of how we feel, whether we're trying to cross the wall or we feel that we want to protect ourselves from who's ever coming in at us. And we need to reconcile that. We need to resolve it, I think. And one of the things that I did with Up Against the Wall from my point of view of an academic was look for where did that phrase come from. And a lot of you may well know that that phrase is often uttered with an expletive at the end of it. And that goes back to the rebellions of the 60s and is often attributed to a Jefferson Airplane story, song, a Jefferson Airplane song. Well, it's a story in the song. And to Mark Rudd, one of the student occupiers during the strike at Columbia University in the mid-60s. But in the book, and I'll just tease it a little bit, I take it back further, and you may be interested in knowing where that up against the wall expletive comes from. But again, looking toward your questions now, all agree, I would suggest, that the border is in chaos. So the question is, what do we do about that? Because it is a problem and it shouldn't be allowed to fester at the expense of people who are dying in the Sonora Desert trying to evade those sections of the border where the barricades are. And it shouldn't be allowed to fester, I believe, as an opportunity for demagogues, those demagogues among our politicians who seize on it to create an other that we supposedly want to be scared about. So let me, if this will work, find a page here that I want to read to you from the book. And then I look forward to your questions. Before the establishment of numerical limits on immigration, immigration into the United States from Mexico was consequential, fueled by both jobs and escape from violence and turmoil of the Mexican Revolution. Now remember, that was 100 years ago. When the US economy then collapsed in the Great Depression, the flow reversed. Mexicans and Mexican-American citizens of the United States went south in huge numbers, many against their will. During the 1930s, in numbers estimated by some experts as high as 2 million, Mexicans and others caught in raids and roundups were shipped south. The motivations for the removal are familiar to the 21st century. Those deported were charged with illegally taking jobs and abusing social services. The exodus south was labeled repatriation, but contemporary news reports and later studies make clear that legal, permanent residents of the United States, temporary workers with legal status, and US citizens who appeared to be Mexican were forced out of the United States along with undocumented residents. The methods used to rid the United States of these workers during the extreme unemployment of the Depression included deportation, persuasion, coaxing, incentive, and unauthorized coercion. Even before the Depression, anti-Mexican fervor was again building in official America. Texas Congressman Eugene Black told the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization in 1928 that Mexicans were not desirable in the United States because they are, quote, germ carriers in asylum, what's the word? I'm having a hard time pronouncing it. When you assimilate, in assimilum, yeah, I can't pronounce the word, but you know what I'm talking about. A people, this is the quote continuing, a people who are with us, but not of us and not for us. That in 1928, almost 100 years ago, sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? And one of the leaders of the offensive against Mexicans during the Depression was Secretary of Labor William Doak. Doak estimated that in 1931, about 400,000 undocumented immigrants were living in the United States. But just as is the case today, Secretary Doak acknowledged that he really couldn't cite an accurate figure. It is obviously impossible, he wrote Congress, to arrive at any concrete figures as to the number of aliens unlawfully in the United States. He deftly added national security fears to his mission, telling lawmakers in his pitch for direct power to orchestrate the assaults on the immigrant population this quote: "There is a need for strengthening the law relative to the deportation of those aliens who are affiliated with organizations which advocate the overthrow of the government of the United States," and President Herbert Hoover backed Doak's maneuvers. The raids were carried out with heavy-handed police tactics designed not only to round up Mexicans and Mexican Americans and send them south, but also to scare Mexicans who heard about them in the hopes that they would leave on their own. So, as is so often the case with history, nothing new here. And from this during the Hoover administration to the 50s and the ugly titled Operation Wetback, which was a similar kind of a maneuver, we are again at a place where I submit we are up against the wall, and we can at least begin a fix by saying that bienvenidos. I look forward to your questions.
All right, Peter, this is the disembodied voice of Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs at WorldOregon. I'm going to jump right in. I actually have a whole slew of questions, but we have wonderfully diligent participants in the audience who have also given you some. So I'm going to start with theirs and then fill in as we go along. So you focus a lot on Mexicans crossing the border, but the majority of people crossing from Mexico come from Central America in the Northern Triangle. And since 2015, the numbers have escalated from California. Can you talk about this phenomenon and how your proposal will assist or open the doors for others than Mexicans?
Sure, and that's a loaded term right there. The Border Patrol refers to OTMs, other than Mexicans, not always in a disparaging way, but it can be used that way. So first of all, those numbers, as are so many numbers, as are statistics always, are questionable. That was the case at a period of time when it was seized on as a campaign issue by the current president. But the more recent numbers indicate that the majority coming across the border without papers, undocumented, illegally, are, again, Mexicans. It really doesn't matter for the point of the argument, because one of the things about my proposal that I hope will be able to be considered by all of us, no matter our political, social points of view, is that it's out of control, it's chaos now. And so even if the goal is to stop those who are coming up from Central America, if we know who the Mexicans are that come north and we welcome them, then the vast Border Patrol force, along with their equipment, can be used to target those we decide we still don't want up here. And I'm taking what might be considered a baby step, one thing at a time. Yes, we have other problems, and it's not just Central America. We have people coming into this country illegally, and often legally. People come to this country, as some of you might have, going on vacation in Europe and deciding you liked it over there and stayed past that 90-day automatic visa. We have people coming to this country legally on a tourist visa and then not going home. So these things are complicated. This issue is complicated. And this one step that I suggest can make it easier for us to address other problems, such as those coming up from Central America who are coming up without documentation.
So if we're out of control and it's chaos, and this is leading into the next question from one of our audience members, would your proposal to open the southern border include quotas on migrants from Mexico and other merit-based criteria?
Absolutely not. There is no reason to do that. We have a declining population. We have, as Cole Porter wrote, land, lots of land, and the starry sky above. So we need the people. We solicit the people. we just perversely, I keep using that word because that's how I feel about it, we just perversely saying, good luck on getting up here, and if you make it, we'll have you in a subservient position because you'll be afraid of asserting your rights, and we'll be able to work you long hours. Not all people who hire people from Mexico without documentation do this, but long hours, poor conditions, firing you if we just get annoyed with you. So no, we can accommodate the people who will come up just as we accommodate the people who come down from Canada. And if we start creating these various criteria for who we want, it just exacerbates our extraordinary selfishness that we have been practicing historically for those from Mexico. There's no need to do that, even if you are selfish.
So in recent years, Charles Koch has come out in favor of open borders. To jumpstart the proposals you're suggesting, would you be adverse to engaging such unlikely allies in the debate?
On the contrary, I think that what's going to save us if we are in the jeopardy of that some of us fear we are of turning into the world's largest banana republic is to figure out how to cross these barriers. And if we can find alliances and allegiances with those we disagree with about all kinds of other stuff, then that begins the reintegration of our society that has become so problematic as we've been suffering the divisiveness of recent years. It was mentioned by Derek that I teach down at the University of Oregon, and one of my ongoing assignments to journalism students is to reach across the so-called urban divide. I know up in Portland and elsewhere you can think of, you can laugh when you hear of Eugene being mentioned as urban, but reach across the urban-rural divide and figure out how to talk with and work with those with whom we may well disagree about all sorts of stuff. I invited, for example, the chairman of the Lane County Republican Party to my features writing course a couple of terms ago. This is what we need to do. So I welcome anybody who wants to work with anybody who believes that this is a good idea, and me, no matter your sordid past.
So populist narratives around the globe have turned in many ways against the right to and the reality of migration. I mean, in the past decade, the government of Australia has spent more than $15 million on an ad campaign designed to deter prospective migrants. Canada has mounted billboards in Hungary to deter Roma asylum seekers. Germany has sponsored posters on Kabul buses. Norway has purchased Facebook ads targeting young men from Eritrea, Ethiopia, Afghanistan. You've visited borders and walls all over the world and have traveled to the wall being built along the U.S. Mexico border. Often, is the current rhetoric in the U.S. any different from these others? And how do we overcome that?
Yeah, we overcome it by accepting reality. So we have this land border that one could argue, I do, even if the terminology is considered politically incorrect in some circles. This is a place, this extraordinarily long border where the first world and the third world meet. And it's also a border, as I mentioned earlier, where we have this interlocking history with Mexico. And we have half of Mexico that we stole in the mid-19th century. So it's a different case than a lot of other places. I'm not suggesting that those circumstances you cite are appropriate. What is being advertised, and that's what it is, an advertisement. But I'm saying that here we have a different set of circumstances because we solicit these people. We are saying to Mexicans, to our hermanos and our hermanas, come up here. We need you. We want you. We just are going to make you run across the desert, and some of you are going to die and others are going to get arrested and sent back to Mexico. But we want you. As soon as you get here, we've got jobs for you that pay 5, 10 times what you're earning in Mexico. And that's a point where it's important to point out that Mexico has responsibility too. It's a vast country still, even though we stole half of it. It's filled with all sorts of natural resources and human resources. And it has an economy that has not recovered from the kind of advantage that's been taken by those who are in power to line their own pockets. And Mexico, of course, has this disastrous problem with the drug cartels and the violence that occurs in Mexico, perpetrators.
So what would you see as the key transitional elements of an immigration policy to realize your vision, as the present political reality seems to preclude a thoughtful dialogue on this issue?
I don't hear the question, if there's a question being answered, and I do see something on my screen that says the internet connection is unstable. So I'll look forward to hearing Tim when I hear his voice again.
Can you hear me now?
I do indeed. I have a friend, Tim, who wrote a play about mobile phone use and problems with mobile phones, and the name of the play is Can You Hear Me Now?
So the question was, what would you see as the key transitional elements of an immigration policy to realize your vision, as the present political reality seems to preclude any thoughtful dialogue on this issue?
Yeah, well, we may see a radical change in Washington in November, and then when the actual change takes place, if it does in January, and that could change the landscape. But it's important to remember that although the current administration, from my point of view and plenty of others, has been egregious beyond belief in terms of its mistreatment of migrants and asylum seekers, and has made use of the border in a counterproductive manner to attempt to politicize it and use it for political advantage. The reality is that it would not take much to change what's going on to what I suggest. All one needs to do is, as I said, create an equal environment for those who wish to come into this country from Mexico to that which we currently do for those who want to come in from Canada. That's the start. And this is in an orderly fashion. We don't have order down there now, and particularly on the Mexican side of the border, since the rules have changed and asylum seekers must wait in Mexico. It has become more problematic on the Mexican side of the border than it has been in the past. So there need not be as much chaos as we see currently. That would be assuaged immediately on policy change.
So it seems to me a lot of your argument is an economic one, but you just mentioned asylum seeking. And this distinction seems to have been lost in recent years in the debate. How do we amplify the humanitarian and economic difference between those who are escaping persecution and seeking asylum and those who are seeking opportunity as we have this debate?
It's a simple answer from my point of view. There need be no overt differentiation. You want a job? I have a job. I haven't filled the job. You know how to do the job? Come on up and apply for the job. You're being oppressed in some manner that meets the criteria of asylum seeking? Then come on up and check in at the border the way it was prior to the change that was fomented by the current administration. Come on up and register as an asylum seeker, as a refugee. These need not be separated. You want to go, as I mentioned, to Disneyland? Come on up and say you want to go to Disneyland. You want to study at the University of Oregon? Welcome you. And so do our sister and brother universities around the country. And I may be naive, and you may be out there in the audience saying, what does that guy with the gray beard think? He probably went to school in Berkeley in the 60s, and you would be right. But that doesn't take away from the logic of it. What we've got now, we all can agree, does not work, and it creates tragic realities for individuals. So it's time to try something else.
So when Vicente Fox was here, he spent a lot of his program talking about drug policy. Fox and Obrador don't agree on a lot, but drug policy seems to be one of them. How much do you think legalization and modulation of the war on drugs might change both asylum seekers fleeing violence and the flow of immigration?
Well, the violence in Mexico is so out of control. It has to be addressed, excuse me, by Mexicans in order to have any kind of reasonable environment in Mexico. And when we have newspapers closing because their reporters are being killed for working on stories, which goes on in Mexico now, as you undoubtedly know, then that's just an example from a journalist's point of view of the kinds of problems that exist in Mexico. But if you look at the realities of just marijuana that have taken place across Cascadia,
Peter, have we lost you?
Bear with us, audience, as we check on technical difficulties. We seem to have lost our connection with our speaker. Bear with us just one moment.
Thanks, Derek.
While we see if we can reestablish connections here, I'm going to say the part that I usually say at the end, which is we have a lot of great upcoming events here shortly. And here looks like, hey, we have Peter back. I will.
It's part of the fun, right? We can just consider there was a fire drill if we were in a live presentation.
Absolutely.
All of us are getting used to it, Derek. I think that we do the best we can, and audiences too realize that this is far from foolproof, but it's great that we can carry on. And I was talking with Tim earlier, not only that, there are some positives. We have larger audiences when we're not confined to an auditorium in Portland. So I'm sure we'll have some sort of hybrid once everything is resolved. So I was telling a long story about this friend who then suffered so much for something as ridiculous as a small amount of marijuana, and now those plants would be legal in Nevada. So yes, that's a long answer to your question. If we can somehow come to terms on both sides of the border with some way to deal with what are now illegal so-called recreational drugs, then that should reduce the power and hence the violence that the cartels create south of the border. And of course, it's not limited to south of the border. They can come north just as anybody else can. And the violence is not contained by a so-called wall.
So a lot of people argue that global inequality isn't inevitable, that immigration is not a zero-sum game, and that opening the world's borders could be an act of revenue-generating humanitarianism. In essence, a form of laissez-faire global distributive justice. Is that part of your argument?
Sure, in the isolated look of the United States and Mexico, the global issues, as we've mentioned, are consequential, and I argue different than that exists along our southern and Mexico's northern border. This is a special relationship. We talk about the special relationship with England and the United Kingdom, but we have a special long-standing relationship with Mexico. One of my examples of that I like is when Pat Buchanan was running for president, I talked to him and we talked about immigration and migration, and he said, what's important is that people assimilate. Well, what does that word mean, really? Assimilate to what? If somebody from Norway wants to move to New Mexico, are they going to assimilate to what was there 500 plus years ago, or even before the Spanish came? We have a country that is gorgeously, beautifully, blessedly varied. And so this special relationship that integrates us, we are, as that example of Vicente Fox's grandfather proves, we go back and forth. A lot of people in the audience now probably vacation in Mexico. Some perhaps are considering retiring in Mexico, where we have huge communities of Americans living their lives out in that beautiful country. So our relationship is different. We've got enormous population realities globally. How a borderless world would work, I haven't thought through. I'm focusing myself on our border with Mexico, even as I look historically at how borders have failed across cultures and across time.
So we recognize that Mexicans provide valuable services in the US, but do you believe they take jobs that Americans want in addition to those farm and service jobs that most Americans don't want? And are you of the opinion that they lower the wage rates for Americans?
First of all, we need to talk a little bit pre-pandemic, because we are in an anomalous crisis right now. But no, the jobs are there. We were at historic unemployment levels, minimal unemployment. And so those jobs are not being taken away. Maybe here and there, some wages are reduced because of the availability of cheaper labor that fears being tossed out of the country or tossed out of the job because they're not in a position to take any kind of action that could result in them being identified as being in the country illegally. So if these people are here legally, then they're not going to be in the same position of potentially reducing a baseline wage structure. On the contrary, they'll be able to work with their brothers and sisters who are already up here at keeping the wages where they should be, or where they would want to be, trying to get them where they would want them to be. And remember, it's not just farm workers and other social services, not in any way to minimize the importance and value of social services is wrong, whatever it's called, the kind of work that is done, maintenance, hotel workers, this sort of work. There's some kind of overriding term for it that I can't think of, but that's not, the people that come up from Mexico are not limited to those jobs by their skills or their desires, nor should they be. And we have job needs across the board, again, pre-pandemic, with the hope that we all have that we can return to the kind of economy that we were enjoying prior to the pandemic.
So in your research, do you address any of the potential and current environmental calamity that could be caused by the wall as planned by the administration, and also the ways the wall crosses through ranches and towns and wildlife preserves, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here in the back of the book cover, you can see the prototype here, one of the prototypes that were put up by Otay Mesa on the east side of the San Diego-Tijuana crossing. And I'm looking this way at this beautiful child who is literally up against the wall. I'm on the Tijuana side looking north there to take the picture. And yes, The problems, it's quite fortunate for many that, that the wall has been a lot of talk and not much building. It's scarring up countryside. It's destroying habitat of migrating animals, including turtles, which that's close to my heart because the book I wrote prior to this was Dreaming in Turtle, which was a look at what's happening to turtle populations globally. And one of the problems is migrating animals, turtles, the threatened panther of the southwest of the Sonora Desert, the people of native lands that straddle the border and historically have gone back and forth and now are finding themselves potentially or actually separated. Some of those lands where the wall is planned or construction has started, and these are what are considered by the people who have been there since before the Spaniards as sacred burial grounds and other sacred grounds. The ridiculousness of the wall being placed in some places, especially around Big Bend in Texas, where in order to get the wall in place, it leaves land that is United States territory and private property on the south side of the wall, so that people want to go home have to go through the wall in order to get home. One could argue that is the current administration ceding American territory to Mexico. It's kind of like your neighbor starts to encroach on your land, and after a while, in a lot of jurisdictions, that then becomes hers or his because they've been on it so long. So the wall is a problem in terms of cost. The wall is a problem in terms of efficiency. The wall is a problem in terms of what it does to migrating animals. The wall is a problem in terms of what it does to native lands. The wall is a problem in terms of what it does to the landscape. The wall is a problem because despite all of that, as one of the Border Patrol officers I hung out with down around Otay Mesa said, anybody can get over it. Anybody can get over it. And he explains all the different ways he's seen people get over it, under it, through it, literally.
So, not to be flip, but the global north is responsible for the great majority of greenhouse gas emissions. What are your thoughts about the opening of the borders as fair exchange for almost 2 centuries of pollution on our part?
Well, I try to look at the issue without that kind of us and them mentality. I'm trying to look at it. I could join that argument and argue on the side of it, but I try to look at the issue as something where it's a win-win. And so if that becomes part of the win in some way in the minds of some people, that's just fine and good on them. But I'm looking at it in a more clear-cut way. How can we all get past the problems that we have now, at least initially, and make it so that this is not deadly for so many people, is not advantageous for criminals, does not serve demagoguery amongst politicians, does not make those who are preying on the workers richer because they can undercut their salaries, which also, to your other question, to the point of that other question, has the potential to jeopardize, as the audience member who asked the question said, the wage of those who are already up here. So that's how I look at the issue. And it seems like a first step that can be taken and tried. Hey, if it doesn't work, you can keep building your wall. I know it's not yours, Tim.
So I'm going to combine a couple questions into one. What do you think it'll take to move the border debate toward an ethos where immigrants are seen not as threats to low-skilled workers, to social services, to public culture, but as generators of wealth traveling as freely as NAFTA-esque commodities and capital? And what paths to citizenship would you envision?
Yeah, I'd like to quote a comedian, Mexican comedian, who said something like, they like our food, they like our music, they like our costumes, they just don't like us. And so how much of it is prejudice against who's coming? I start the book with my father's passage from Middle Europe through Ellis Island, when people from Middle Europe were considered in the same way people from Mexico and south of the border are considered now, as some kind of social threat in addition to being an economic threat. So to that point, I'll have to say I started thinking about my father, and I forgot the punchline of your question, Tim. Tell me again, please.
Well, the last part was, what paths to citizenship would you envision?
Yes, yes. I think that that's premature at this point, to my wanting to just do something to get the conversation going about normalizing the border in terms of a crossing, so that it is not a killing field and it's not chaos and it can't be taken advantage of. I'm all for paths to citizenship. I am obviously the son of an immigrant. I have great sympathy and appreciation for the immigrants of this country, and that's all of us. That's so easily forgotten. That's all of us. And so, of course, there should be paths to citizenship if somebody wants to join us. Sometimes I wonder who would want to join us, as I look longingly at New Zealand and Canada during moments of depression. So paths to citizenship make sense, particularly in a country with a population that is no longer growing. We need people. We need skilled people. We need unskilled people. We need people with fine educations. We need people who seek fine educations. We need smart, motivated, hardworking people. Imagine how hard working somebody is who goes through the arduous process of getting up here across that barrier that's designed to keep them from being up here. That's not some lazy bum.
I thought for a moment you were going to break into Barbra Streisand's People there. So I got one more question, and then we're going to bring it back around, let Derek take us out into the day. So the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, one of the big things in there is alleviating global poverty. Brian Kaplan wrote a great book a few years ago called Open Borders, on the science and ethics of immigration. And he suggests that open borders would make poverty more visible. And he says immigration restrictions hide even more poverty than they create. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that to kind of close us out.
Yeah, well, I think that we are doing a magnificent job of trying to hide poverty, and we don't see the misery that we create both south of the border with people trying to come up here, and what it costs them to come up here illegally, and the conditions that they live in before they make a break for crossing the border. And then if they get caught and get transported back south of the border, the conditions they're in if they decide to make another attempt, and so many do. And then the conditions that exist up here, where people who are living underground basically are having to figure out how to do that in conditions that many of us would find appalling. So that might not be the kind of poverty that you're referring to in terms of a global poverty, but regarding this line that separates so often the United States and Mexico, that creates its own kind of a poverty as long as the migration continues, which it always will, and as long as we make it so difficult and illegal for so many people to come across, and they then are in this liminal zone suffering from not having an income and having to live in a substandard manner while they're making that transition across.
Great. Thanks a lot, Peter. I'm going to bring Derek back on to close out the program. As always, it's always great talking with you, Peter, and I look forward to our next program.
Well, I do too, and I just want to say again, Tim, thank you to you for connecting me with President Fox that resulted in such an intriguing few days down at his hacienda, and just a fine foreword for the book. Another example of the terrific work that World Oregon does, both overtly with programs like this and elsewhere, just connecting people. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for that really engaging discussion, the great audience questions. And that is our mission, to connect Oregon with the world and the world with Oregon. So it's wonderful to be part of this with you. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We have some great upcoming programs. Next week, we have not scheduled as many on our own because some of our partners on the national level are having some really intriguing programs. The World Affairs Councils of America has conversations with the C-suite, which is really going to focus in on some private sector leaders who have an interest in international issues. Those were in our e-newsletter. Likewise, our counterparts at the World Affairs Council of Connecticut have a security-focused series of webinars with military and national security leaders. And so we have backed off here locally so that we can partner with our national ones. Starting again in October, we'll have more events coming. Our young professionals have a global trivia. If you haven't done that before, it's fun to do. Uses Zoom and something called Kahoot, which is kind of a neat platform. And then we're partnering with the Pacific Northwest International Trade Association, October 15th, for a nonpartisan look at potential trade policies for the two major parties. That's a big issue for Oregon, an economy that always traditionally is more engaged with international commerce than most states. And then last, but definitely not least, we are launching in October a 4-part series on culturally relevant teaching for K through 12 teachers throughout the beauty, again, through Zoom, could be throughout the state. It's a 4-part series. As limited participation, just went up on our website and included in our e-newsletter. So if you know teachers or maybe your children's teacher, encourage them to get engaged with that. It's a key part, I think, in the future of our education and connecting to our diversifying student base. It's wonderful again to have you all here. Peter, best wishes with the sales of the book. Remember, the link for the book is in the chat, or you can just Google it up against the wall in your favorite bookseller of choice. Thanks for joining us today. And it's